Look at it. It's the image we all have in our minds when we think of peace. The escape. A place to get away from the noise, the chaos, the dangers of the city. The countryside is sold to us as a sanctuary, a place where the silence is a comfort, and the nearest neighbor being miles away is a blessing. But what if that's a lie? What if the silence isn't empty, but just listening? What if the distance between you and your neighbor isn't a comfort, but a liability? Out here, there are no sirens to call, no witnesses to scream for. Out here, the darkness is absolute, and some of the oldest, strangest things still hold power. Tonight, we're peeling back the beautiful facade to reveal the chilling reality that sometimes lurks beneath. These aren't campfire tales. These are accounts from people who went looking for peace and found something else waiting for them in the quiet places of the world. Hello, and welcome. For many, the idea of countryside horror is something you see in movies. A broken down car on a desolate road, a creepy gas station attendant, a family of backwoods cannibals. But reality is often quieter and far more disturbing. The three stories you are about to hear come from individuals who reached out, people who needed to tell someone what they experienced because they felt no one else would believe them. These are stories of isolation, of ancient traditions that never died, and of the terrifying realization that you are truly, utterly alone. Leo was 16 the year his parents sent him to help his grandparents on their corn farm. It was a sprawling, ancient property that had been in the family for generations. The farmhouse was old but sturdy, surrounded on three sides by a seemingly endless ocean of corn that rustled and whispered with every breeze. His grandfather was a man of few words, weathered by decades of sun and hard work. On Leo's first day, the old man gave him only two rules. The first was simple: always latch the gates, no exceptions. The second was delivered with a gravity that made the hair on Leo's arm stand up. He pointed a leathery finger towards the cornfields, which were already glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. After the sun dips below that horizon, he said, his voice a low rumble, "You do not go in the corn. Not for anything. You hear me, boy? Not for a lost tool, not for a dare, not for God himself. The corn has its own ways after dark." Leo, being a teenager from the suburbs, just nodded along. He figured it was an old man's superstition, or maybe a practical warning about getting lost. He had no idea how serious his grandfather was. The first few weeks were normal. Hard work, long days, and deep, dreamless sleep at night. But then, little things started to feel off. Sometimes, while working near the edge of the fields, he'd see movement out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of motion deep within the rows of corn. He'd stop and stare, but there was never anything there. He blamed it on the heat and fatigue. Then came the nights. The farmhouse had a scarecrow in the main field, a classic one made of old clothes stuffed with straw, a burlap sack for a head with a crudely painted face. From his bedroom window, Leo could just make it out, a lonely silhouette against the moonlit sky. But on some nights, he'd swear it wasn't in the same position he'd last seen it. One evening, its head would be tilted to the left. The next morning, it would be facing straight ahead. He asked his grandmother about it. She just gave a tight, nervous smile and changed the subject. The real fear began about a month into his stay. He had a golden retriever named Buster, who had come with him for the summer. Buster was his shadow, following him everywhere. One evening, just as dusk was settling, Leo was on the porch, cleaning some tools. Buster was chasing fireflies at the edge of the yard, right where the grass met the first row of corn. Leo heard a sharp yell. He looked up just in time to see Buster, tail between his legs, darting into the cornfield. He vanished into the dense stalks. "Buster, get back here," Leo yelled, his heart starting to pound. The sun had just set. His grandfather's warning echoed in his mind. But that was his dog. He couldn't just leave him. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from the porch, and against every instinct screaming at him, stepped into the corn. The air inside the field was immediately different. It was 10 degrees cooler, dead still, and the sounds of the night, the crickets, the distant frogs, were gone. The only sound was the rustle of his own feet against the dry leaves on the ground. "Buster," he called out, his voice sounding small and weak. The beam of his flashlight cut a shaky tunnel through the suffocating darkness. The corn stalks were so tall and dense, it felt like being in a maze. He was only 20 feet in, but when he looked back, he couldn't see the farmhouse lights anymore. Panic began to set in. He heard a whimper. It was close. "Buster, I'm coming, boy," he shouted, pushing forward. He broke through a particularly thick patch of stalks, and the flashlight beam fell on a small, cleared circle. In the center of the circle was the scarecrow from the field. But it wasn't a scarecrow anymore. It was standing, but not on a post. It was taller than he remembered, impossibly tall. The clothes were the same, but they seemed to cling to a frame that was too thin, too angular to be straw. The burlap sack head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and the painted smile seemed to stretch wider in the bobbing light of his flashlight. And from beneath the frayed cuffs of its sleeves and trousers, he could see what looked like dried corn husks and dark, gnarled roots, woven together to form limbs. It was perfectly still. Leo's blood ran cold. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. His mind was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, slowly, one of its woven, root-like arms began to lift. It didn't bend like an arm. It unraveled and rewove itself into a raised position, pointing deeper into the corn. That's when he heard the whimper again. But this time it was different. It was cut short by a wet, snapping sound, a sound of finality. Leo didn't scream. The sound was trapped in his throat. He just turned and ran. He didn't care about the path. He just crashed through the stalks, branches whipping at his face. He could hear it behind him. Not footsteps, but a dry, slithering, rustling sound, like 1,000 dead leaves being dragged across the ground at an impossible speed. It was keeping pace with him. Just behind him, a constant, terrifying whisper of motion. He burst out of the cornfield and tumbled onto the grass of the yard, gasping for air. The porch light of the farmhouse seemed like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He scrambled to his feet and didn't stop running until he was inside. The door slammed shut and locked behind him. His grandparents were in the living room. His grandfather looked at his terrified, bleeding face, then glanced at the closed door, and a look of profound sadness and understanding crossed his features. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. Leo never saw Buster again. He finished the summer in a state of quiet terror, never once looking at the scarecrow, which was back on its post the next morning, and never, ever going near the cornfield after sunset. Before he left, his grandfather finally spoke of it. He said every so often, the field gets hungry, that the harvest man, as his own father used to call it, tends to the crops. But it requires a payment, a toll. Usually, it was a coyote, a deer. Sometimes, it was more. Leo is in his 40s now. He lives in a high-rise apartment in the middle of a bustling city, and he says he can't stand the sound of rustling leaves. He knows what he saw was no simple scarecrow. It was something ancient, something tied to that land, a perfect and horrifying example of true countryside horror, where the oldest rules are the only ones that matter. Isolation does strange things to the human mind. It can make you imagine things, amplify your fears. But sometimes, the isolation isn't the cause of the fear. It's simply the thing that prevents you from escaping it. Our second story is a terrifying reminder of that. It comes from a couple, Mark and Sarah, who thought they had found their dream home. They called this experience the voice on the radio. Mark and Sarah were tired of city life. The noise, the cost, the sheer number of people. They saved for years and finally bought a small, secluded house in the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina. It was a fixer-upper, but it had good bones, and most importantly, it was private. Their nearest neighbor was 2 miles down a winding, gravel road. The property was beautiful, surrounded by dense forest and a babbling creek. To them, it was paradise. They spent the first few months renovating, painting walls, sanding floors, making the house their own. It was blissful. The quiet was exactly what they'd wanted. But after the work was done and they settled into a routine, the quiet started to feel different, heavy. It started with the radio. They had an old shortwave radio they'd found in the attic. Mark, a bit of a tinkerer, had gotten it working. Most nights, they'd listen to music or talk shows from distant cities as they cooked dinner. One evening, as Sarah was listening to a station from Atlanta, the signal suddenly cut out, replaced by a wall of harsh static. Then, through the static, a voice. It was a man's voice, monotone and calm, speaking slowly. But he wasn't speaking words. He was just listing numbers. 7, 4, 1, 9, 0. A pause, then another string. 5, 3, 3, 8, 1. Sarah called Mark over. They listened for about a minute as the disembodied voice continued its cold, numerical broadcast. Mark fiddled with the dial, but the voice seemed to be on every frequency. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The Atlanta music station faded back in as if nothing had happened. They were intrigued more than scared. Mark joked it was a number station, a spy broadcast from the Cold War that was still running. It became a strange quirk of their new rural life. Every few nights, it would happen. The radio would cut out, and the voice would start listing numbers for a minute or two before disappearing. This is where many true scary stories begin, with something odd, something you can explain away. They got used to it, but then the phenomenon began to evolve. One night, the voice changed. It was no longer just numbers. The radio cut to static, and the same monotone voice said, clear as day, blue truck on the gravel road. Mark and Sarah looked at each other, confused. Less than a minute later, they heard the crunch of tires. They looked out the window and saw their neighbor's old blue pickup truck driving past their house on the way to his own. It was the first time they'd seen him in a week. Coincidence, they thought. A bizarre, creepy coincidence. A few days later, it happened again. Deer at the creek. Mark went to the back porch. Standing by the creek, taking a drink, were 3 deer. The fear was no longer a background hum. It was a cold, sharp point pressing into them. The voice wasn't broadcasting randomly. It was describing things happening in real time, right outside their house. It was watching them. How was this possible? There were no other houses for miles. No vantage point that could see both the road and the creek. The couple began to feel like prisoners in their own home. They stopped turning on the radio, but it didn't matter. One night, they were sitting in complete silence when they heard the voice, faint but clear, coming from the unplugged radio in the corner of the room. Girl in the yellow dress on the porch. Sarah was wearing a yellow sundress, and she had been on the porch swing just 10 minutes earlier. She burst into tears. This was no longer a quirky, rural paranormal encounter. It was a targeted, psychological torment. They were being observed by an unseen, unknown entity with a voice that could somehow transmit itself through their radio, plugged in or not. The final straw came a week later. They were packing a bag, getting ready to spend a few nights at a hotel in the nearest town, just to get away. They were moving quietly, trying not to make a sound, as if the house itself was listening. As Mark was zipping up the suitcase, the voice came from the radio again, louder than ever before. It wasn't monotone this time. It was a low, guttural whisper, filled with something that sounded like amusement. It said just 2 words: don't leave. They were out of that house in 5 minutes. They left the suitcase, left food on the counter, left the radio. They drove to a hotel, and the next day, they called a realtor. They sold the house at a massive loss, never returning to collect their things. The realtor who handled the sale later told them that the new owners, a young family, loved the place. They said it was the most peaceful, quiet home they'd ever known. They never heard a thing. Mark and Sarah don't know what was in that house or on that land. Was it a spirit? Some strange localized radiation that affected their minds? Or was something living in the woods, watching them with a walkie-talkie and a twisted sense of humor? They don't know. All they know is that it was real. It was watching them, and it wanted them to stay. Our final story is perhaps the most unsettling because it deals with a fear that is deeply ingrained in us. The fear of what might be living just on the other side of a wall. This account was sent in by a woman named Clara, and it's a chilling tale about how the most mundane problem can become an absolute nightmare. She simply called it The Renters. Clara was a graphic designer who worked from home. When her great-aunt passed away, she inherited a small, rustic cabin deep in the forests of Oregon. The place was cluttered and neglected, but for Clara, who was craving solitude to focus on her work, it was perfect. She spent a week cleaning it out, throwing away decades of accumulated junk and making the small space her own. The cabin was truly isolated. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive away. There was no cell service, only a spotty satellite internet connection. At night, the darkness was so complete it felt like a physical weight. The first sign of trouble was a sound she was familiar with, scratching. It came from the walls, mostly at night. Mice, she thought. It's an old cabin in the woods. Of course there are mice. She bought half a dozen traps in town and set them up in the kitchen and along the baseboards where the sound was loudest. The next morning, the bait, a dab of peanut butter, was gone from every trap, but not a single one had been sprung. She found this odd. Maybe it was rats? They were smarter, so she bought heavy-duty rat traps. The same thing happened. The bait would be gone, the traps untouched. This went on for a week. The scratching continued, sometimes sounding less like the frantic scrabbling of a rodent and more like a slow, deliberate scraping, like a fingernail being dragged along wood. Then, her own food started going missing. A sealed packet of crackers from the pantry, an apple left on the counter. She started putting everything in the refrigerator. One morning, she found the fridge door slightly ajar and a carton of milk on the floor with a small, neat hole punctured in the side, empty. Fear, cold and sharp, began to replace her annoyance. This wasn't an animal. An animal would have made a mess, torn the packaging, knocked things over. This was tidy. It was careful. She started locking her bedroom door at night. The scratching sounds grew bolder. They were no longer just in the kitchen walls, but in her bedroom walls too, right behind her headboard. One night, she was jolted awake by a soft thump, thump, thump from inside the wall. It wasn't scratching. It sounded like something small and soft being tapped against the drywall. Her mind raced. A squatter? Could someone be living in the crawl space or the walls themselves? The thought was so horrific she almost threw up. The cabin was tiny. The idea of sharing it with an unknown presence was unbearable. She tried to rationalize it. It had to be a raccoon or a family of squirrels. But she knew. Deep down, she knew it wasn't. The confirmation came on a Tuesday. She had lost one of her favorite silver earrings a few days prior. She'd searched everywhere for it. That morning, she went to make coffee and found the earring sitting perfectly in the center of the kitchen table. She stared at it, her blood turning to ice. Something had taken it from her bedroom, held onto it, and then decided to return it. It was a message, a statement. We are here. We can get to your things. We can get to you. This is the very essence of rural paranormal encounters. The slow, creeping violation of your sanctuary until you are no longer sure if you are the owner or the one being observed. Clara had to know. She had to see. Her terror was now overshadowed by a desperate, morbid curiosity. That night, armed with a drill and a flashlight, she waited. The scratching behind her headboard began around 2 a.m. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She waited for it to stop. Then she quietly got out of bed, picked up the drill, and drilled a tiny peephole through the drywall, right where the sound had been. She took a deep breath, turned off her flashlight, and put her eye to the hole. It was pitch black on the other side, inside the wall. She waited, letting her eye adjust. A faint, pale shape began to resolve itself in the darkness. It was close, very close to the hole, and then it blinked. It was an eye, a human eye, pale, bloodshot, and wide. It was staring right back at her. It wasn't the eye of a mouse or a rat or a raccoon. It was undeniably, horribly human. And as she watched, frozen in pure, primal terror, a tear welled up in the corner of that eye and traced a dirty path down a sliver of pale skin. Then it blinked again, slow and deliberate. Clara didn't make a sound. She backed away from the wall, grabbed her car keys and her wallet, and walked out of the cabin, leaving the door wide open. She got in her car and drove, and she didn't look back. She never went back. She signed the property over to the state, let them deal with it. She has no idea what she saw. A feral person living in the walls, the ghost of her reclusive aunt, or something else. Something that had been renting a space in that cabin for years, living a silent, parasitic life just inches away from the inhabitants. All she knows is that she looked through a hole and something looked back, and in that moment, her understanding of the world shattered. The countryside holds a different kind of fear. It's a fear born of silence, of distance, and of the unknown. The stories of Leo, Mark, Sarah, and Clara are stark reminders that when you strip away the noise and the lights of our modern world, you can sometimes find yourself face to face with things that are ancient, inexplicable, and utterly terrifying. It makes you wonder, what other stories are out there, waiting in the quiet places? What sounds can be heard on the wind when you're the only one around to listen? Thank you for joining us for these unsettling accounts. The world is a strange place, and sometimes the most peaceful settings hide the darkest secrets. If you have your own story you'd like to share, please feel free to reach out to us in the comments or through our email in the description. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, please show your support by hitting that like button. And if you want to hear more explorations into the unexplained, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the dark. Stay safe out there, and maybe think twice the next time you crave a little peace and quiet.